right. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. I'm really excited to be here with the group that has been studying René Girard with Jeff Schellenberger over the past several weeks, 6 or 7 weeks now. Everyone here has been reading deeply, discussing deeply about pretty much all of the big ideas of René Girard. And I have not been part of this group at all. I've just, kind of facilitated it happening, but I haven't been in the group. So it's always really exciting and rewarding for me to join these final sessions, which we share with the public, just as a kind of informal group discussion panel style, kind of like what you would encounter at an academic conference or something like this. What we're going to do is over the next hour or two, I'm just going to kind of go around the room and we're going to hear short presentations from everyone in this group who's been studying René Girard over the past few weeks. So I'm going to invite everyone here to speak for about 5 minutes. Everyone here has prepared some talks. We have abstracts at my side right here. And so I will just introduce people. I'll say a few very brief words about the some of the ideas or the concepts that will be discussed in the presentation. And I think what we'll do is we'll just kind of we'll go pretty fast. We'll just do 5-minute talks, one after another. If people want to interject, between talks, if something is, really exciting to you or fresh on your mind that you want to throw out there, you're more than welcome to do that. We can keep things fairly loose and fun. But I suspect most of the discussion will happen at the end of the time when everyone has given their talks. And I'll be kind of taking some notes as we go as well. So maybe I'll have some comments. I'm hearing all of this stuff fresh for the first time. I don't know all of you yet. I don't know what you've been talking about over the past several weeks. So yeah, I'll have a kind of impartial third-party perspective on some of the themes that emerge, and maybe there'll be some commonalities or some interesting discussion points that I might be able to tease out because I haven't been in the group for the past, several weeks. So yeah, I just want to say I'm very happy to be here. I'm very grateful to be here. I'm very, grateful that you've all participated in this and really given a lot of work to all of this. So yeah, big thanks to Jeff for hosting all of these sessions, teaching all of these sessions and facilitating them over the past few weeks. And, big thanks to all of you for coming out here and for, prepping some of your finest, thoughts at the culmination of all of this. So yeah, I'm really excited and happy to be here. And I'm also always very proud to share with, a public audience and everyone who follows my YouTube channel, my podcast or whatever. People are always, pretty interested in, what is coming out of these seminars. So yeah, without further ado, I think we'll just go ahead and get started unless anyone has any questions or comments or wants to jump in with anything. In no particular order, why don't we just start with, let's start with Alex Taylor. Alex is going to be discussing a few different concepts in his own way. He's going to be talking about romantic love in general and the relationships between men and women and what he's learned or what he's thinking on these topics, issuing from his recent study of René Girard. So without further ado, Alex Taylor, please.
Thank you very much, Justin, for organizing all this. And Jeff, really appreciated your hard work as well. So thanks to both of you for everything. So one of the first questions that we discussed when we were getting into our first seminar discussion after having read Girard's first work, in large part, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, was, is romantic love actually possible? Right? This is an extraordinarily relevant question because most people have this desire to have, right, someone that they're in a relationship with that's long-term, that is mutually fulfilling, right? And I think that Girard challenges, I would say, what I would call a capital R romantic love, as distinguished from kind of what we commonly take to be romantic love, although there's some overlap between the two notions. But I do think that he also allows us the resources when drawing on several other theorists of love in the Christian tradition specifically. I'm thinking of C.S. Lewis, Denis de Rougemont, and Pope Benedict XVI. When Girard is taken with those other thinkers, I think he gives us the resources to really think through this question and think about how mimetic desire and a proper understanding of what it is can contribute to these kind of lifelong fulfilling relationships. So the basic problem that Girard's account of mimetic desire poses to the idea of romantic love is mimetic desire as we see it in Deceit, Desire, in the Novel is conflictual. It is rivalrous. It is generated by and generates envy, right? And there's this question of, if this is fundamentally what love is, then why would any of us want to engage in it, right? It seems all very negative. But Girard himself clarifies later in his career. There's a kind of summary of what he says by a friend of his and a scholar of his work, James Williams. And Williams says that it's actually true that mimetic desire is good in itself, and it is the basis of love, although it is often corrupted. So this is something that we need to kind of think through, and I would suggest that by processing the idea of triangular desire as Girard presents it to us in Deceit, Desire in the novel, we can come to a better understanding of why this is the case or how this is possible. So subpoint 1 is simply that mimetic desire is actually a good thing, and it is the basis of love, although often corrupted. Subpoint 2, to develop the metaphor of the triangle, right? Mimetic desire is triangular. So what does this mean? Capital R romantic desire, right? This paradigm that comes to us largely from, I would say, the 18th and 19th centuries, gives us an idea of an autonomous subject, right? Autonomous meaning simply in its etymology, right? Autos nomos, being a law unto oneself, right? So we have a subject who sees an object and desires it. There's a straight line is the image that Girard uses. But Girard rejects this image, suggesting that desire is actually triangular, right? Such that we have the subject, the object, and a mediating presence. Notably, he does say in Deceit, Desire in the novel, and I quote, in sexual desire, the presence of a rival is not needed in order to term the desire triangular. So this clarifies for us that the mediator does not have to be an actual human person. For instance, when Girard talks about Don Quixote, he's talking about Amadis de Gaul as this imaginary knight who, although himself is imaginary, the mediation is not imaginary. So the distinction here that's important is between external and internal mediation. And Girard, using the image of the triangle, says it's about the spiritual distance between the mediator and the other presences in the triangle. External is farther away and therefore not rivalrous, whereas internal is closer and therefore rivalrous. So the third point of this, right, where I think Girard can be expanded in a way that I think he almost like has a tendency to go in his later work. The idea of the distinction between Eros and Agape, right? So this is made by Lewis, as well as just kind of generally in some Greek thought and thoroughly throughout the Christian tradition. Eros, right, the idea of love as a kind of passionate movement out of the self towards the other, a desire of the other for one's own possession, we might say, as compared to Agape, which is a kind of self-giving love, a movement of the self to the other for the other's sake. We could use the word gift to describe that. So my suggestion in brief here is that we can think about part of the desiring portion of what love is as two different kinds of triangles, that there are erotic triangles and agapic triangles, and that in a successful relationship, both triangles will be present and will be related to each other in a certain respect. So I think this is something that, you know, we can actually, as Girard does, engage with not only the theological tradition, but also some of the great romantic novels in order to see where this is explicitly missing, that some authors are kind of pointing out to us. So just to again kind of conclude with my main point, what I would assert, triangular desire, although it may appear to us to be extraordinarily problematic in the ways that we see it, is not intrinsically corrupt, that is to say envious or rivalrous. But if it is externally mediated by the good of the other, can be a force for good in the world and in our own lives. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. I appreciate that. Made some notes, and those are some really interesting suggestions. I think a next person who I think would be good to follow on with this would be Jessica Baldanza. Jessica, if you'd like to go next. Jessica is going to speak also about deceit, desire in the novel, Madame Bovary, and some other questions related to gender and the internal or external mediation of desire. So please, Jessica, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, 1 second. Okay. So I sort of came to this idea connecting the readings that we've done in the Girard course with also the Ivan Illich readings they did in Nina Power's course before. So I didn't mention that in my abstract, but so basically going off of Alex's point, Girard in Deceit, Desire in the novel presents this idea of all desire as mediated. And this mediation takes the form of a triangle in which the desired object is always mediated. The desiring subject wants an object because it is mediated by a model who they either are explicitly or not explicitly aware of. And this takes the form of either externally mediated desire or internally mediated desire. So externally mediated desire is when the model is sort of held above the subject in an explicitly admiring way. So in the case of Don Quixote, it's this model of chivalrous knighthood that he's aspiring towards very consciously and that he will never reach. And then in internally mediated desire, it's an unconscious rival where the distance is short enough that there can be a conflict occurring over a desired object. So how this connects to Ivan Illich is that he actually uses Girard in his book, I think it's 1980 book, Gender, on the relationship between men and women that has changed in industrial societies. So comparing pre-industrial notions of gender to post-industrial notions of gender. Illich notices that a previously interdependent relationship in which gendered relations between men and women were very clearly defined and complementary becomes a rivalrous relationship in post-industrial societies when the distinctions between men and women's roles are done away with. So, for instance, with labor, there's no longer a distinction between labor that's for men and labor that's for women. Either one can do the same role and therefore they're competing for it. So he sort of succinctly puts it in the sentence, while the asymmetry between genders has always inspired awe, the hierarchic distribution of power among theoretical equals inspires envy. So in Deceit, Desire, the novel, Girard uses the book Madame Bovary as sort of this primary example of externally mediated desire, insofar as Emma Bovary looks to her literary heroines for examples of as models. It's what she's sort of aspiring to very explicitly. She wants to be a heroine. She looks to the Parisians at the ball with great envy and sort of admiration, and they're untouchable. There's a distance between them that's not just physical, but spiritual. However, Girard does not acknowledge that there's also an example of internally mediated desire in Madame Bovary. Rather, he goes to other literary sources for examples of that. So the example of internally mediated desire is actually the relationship between Emma and the men in her life. So her relationship to not only her husband, but her two lovers and also her father and father-in-law is very much a rivalrous one. So she's extremely envious of men. She's jealous of them. She's constantly competing with them. And throughout the book, she will at various points don male garb, take on male affect, basically embody sort of male roles. And in the end of the book, she actually ends up sort of inverting the relationship with her lover Léon so that he becomes her mistress as opposed to she becomes his. And it's noted that Léon actually starts taking on her affects. She becomes model. So in this way, there's just a great opportunity for an example of internally mediated desire that Girard does not acknowledge in lieu of other literary sources. So there's one particularly good quote. She says, "She wanted a son, he would be strong and dark, and she would call him George." And this idea of having a male child was like an anticipated revenge for the powerlessness of her past. A man, at least, is free. He can explore each passion in every kingdom, conquer obstacles, feast upon the most exotic pleasures, but a woman is continually thwarted. So this idea that men have this freedom that she does not, and that they don't experience this sort of like unsatiated desire that she does, is the source of this envy and ultimately this conflict that she has and continual dissatisfaction.
Okay, fascinating. Adding some original insight to the literature on Flaubert. I appreciate that. I might have some questions, but I think I'll save them for later. But that's good. Questions are good. So thank you so much, Jessica. I appreciate that. If anyone wants to interject with anything fresh on your mind, you're welcome to. But like I said, otherwise, I think we'll just default to going one after another. So all right. How about, again, in no particular order, let's go with Sean Burke, shall we? Sean is going to speak on, I think Sean has slides, by the way. So Sean, you should be welcome to share your screen. If you go ahead and try to do that, let me know if you need any help with that. And yeah, Sean is going to be talking about hominization in light of some recent discoveries in primatology and paleoanthropology. So a little bit of change of gears here from literature over more to, the historical sciences. So this should be interesting. All right, we're seeing your screen, Sean. So perfect. Go ahead, take it away.
All right, let me see if, okay, good. Yeah, this is slide 1. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Justin and Jeff, for what's been a great class, and all of my classmates as well. It's been a pleasure to do this. So what I tried to do with this topic is to integrate 2 things that I'm interested in, and things that I've done some recent reading on. I'm not a primatologist. I'm not a paleoanthropologist or anthropologist, even by training or background, let alone profession. But it's a subject of great interest, and hopefully I can link up some information that you'll find interesting that I think compels a thoughtful perspective with respect to Girard's theory of hominization. Girard's theory of hominization, at least as I understand it, is a theory on the origin of anatomically and culturally modern Homo sapiens. That's our species. And in outlining that theory, I was struck by it's remarkable how much Girard understood about the context to this concept in the late 70s. He well understood the existence of the debate between ethologists, that's a synonym for animal behaviorists, essentially, and anthropologists, and presumably Skinnerian behaviorists. The debate consisting of ethologists on the one hand arguing for the validity of drawing inferences from animal behavior studies to human culture and cultural traits and biological traits, behavioral traits, whereas anthropologists, on the other hand, and animal behaviorists, under the influence of Skinner during this period in the middle of the 20th century, really held the view that humans were so distinct from animals that there were almost no inferences we could draw across a purported continuity among species. But Girard recognized this debate and recognized the contribution of ethology to his theory of hominization. And as I'll show in the next slide, hopefully, had he lived to hear of subsequent discoveries, would have also incorporated those into his theories as well. He recognized that imitation and rivalry are fundamental to learning and social relations, not just in humans, but also among animal species as well. And before we move to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight what I think is the key passage in Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, which appears on page 96. He says, "We can conceive of hominization as a series of steps that allow for the domestication of progressively increasing and intense mimetic effects, separated from one another by crises that would be catastrophic, but also generative." And he goes on. All right. So this theory of hominization, I think, is worth, now can you see when I go, all right, now can you see the second slide?
Yes.
Okay, great, yeah. So what could Girard not have known, writing as he was in the late 70s about subsequent discoveries in primatology? Well, they're fascinating. And Progressively, we've learned that animal learning and sociality are not merely instinctual behaviors, but they're sophisticated, especially among primates, and in particular, chimpanzees, our closest relations in the animal kingdom. It's thought that our hominin line of our human ancestors diverged from chimpanzees probably between 6 and 12 million years ago. I think it's probably on the lower side of that. Most paleoanthropologists think. So it's very important to understand those similarities. Contrary to what's discussed in Things Hidden by Girard and his interlocutors, dominance among chimpanzee males is not static. It's constantly contested and political. And I have a reference here to a great book on this subject, Frans de Waal's Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? That's the cover of the book. Violence also differs intragroup from intergroup. Chimpanzees actually can be quite violent with other chimpanzee groups and can go on murderous raids, but violence is mediated within a chimpanzee group, often by females among the males. Chimps are imitative, and they have a strong trait toward imitation, as do humans. And that reflects a capacity both for learning and the transference of learned behavior, which is a phenomenal discovery, largely attributable to Japanese primatologists such as Tetsuro Matsuzawa. Okay, what do some of these recent discoveries, which are really, let me just underscore, these discoveries are really distinct from what was understood to characterize animal behavior in the late 70s, which was thought to be largely instinctual, not subject to learning. And Girard's theories in the late 70s necessarily reflected that view that there was not a continuity of behavioral traits across species and all members of the animal kingdom, but the humans were so distinct that we need to think of them as being, separate unto itself within the animal kingdom. But what do these discoveries suggest for Girard's theory? Well, Girard outlines a progressive process for hominization and the origin of our species and culture, but does not specify a temporal dimension. In that passage, at least on page 96 that I read, he doesn't specify when this is taking place or over how long a period these series of escalating crises are taking place. The implication is that it's taking place within a distinctly human species, or what we would consider now to be the hominin line, Homo sapiens and our human ancestors, as distinct from other members of the great apes, including chimpanzees. Recent discoveries in primatology strongly suggest that fundamental elements of mimesis and rivalry, imitation, and mediation of that rivalry originate much earlier in evolutionary time. We can see key aspects of those things in chimpanzees in particular that engage in imitation, engage in rivalry, that engage in mediated sociality and complicated social behaviors. Dominance, for example, among chimpanzees is not merely static, but it's subject to subversion and subterfuge among chimpanzees that have the capacity for perspective taking. Summing up, what can we draw from comparing these discoveries to Girard's theories? Well, they both corroborate Girard's postulation, I think, of mimesis as a fundamental trait to sociality. There's no question about that. Mimesis is fundamental to learning and to social behavior in other primates as well as humans, but it also forces us to reconsider the temporal dimension of hominization, as well as the cause of what might have triggered these series of escalating steps resulting in the victimage mechanism, which he postulates as being the true pivotal point in the emergence of anatomically and culturally modern Homo sapiens.
Okay, amazing. Fascinating. Well, I mean, one question I can't help but ask immediately is, do you have a guess at what is that alternative cause? If we have to reconsider the cause of escalation, what is your hunch?
My hunch is that these fundamental aspects of mimesis and imitation are much more, they're more fundamental than we might have thought as being specific to merely humans, right? That they go back farther in time. I think there's nothing in what I'm reading and summarizing here that contradicts the notion of the victimage mechanism being essential to the origin of a specifically human culture, ritual, and prohibitions. But it's it is striking to think about if there's this much longer kind of continuity of progression, if mimetic rivalry is not unique to humans, albeit not in quite the complex and sophisticated way that we see in humans. But if we can see it in other species, we have to look back farther in time for where this, for how it's progressing. And it becomes harder to fix, to situate in time. I mean, he starts this chapter in Things Hidden by asking, where do we situate in time the victimage mechanism? And I think once we recognize that fundamental aspects of mimetic rivalry are older in evolutionary time, it becomes even harder to situate the victimage mechanism in time. And he's sort of tracing it to the emergence of violent traits among humans, but when are they? It's hard. It's just, right. I don't know. It's hard to say.
Fascinating. Well, thank you for this. Very interesting mixing in of some other disciplines, not just literary criticism and literature. So this is quickly becoming a very fascinating and well-rounded, eclectic set of discussions. So thank you, Sean. Appreciate it. You can unshare your screen now if you would. So
all right. There we go.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Great. All right. Fantastic. This is these are all really amazing. This is really fun to listen to. All right. Again, in no particular order, how about Sarah Harper? Would you like to take the mic, Sarah? Sarah is going to, I believe, share some multimedia. She'll be sharing about the concept of the scapegoat, talking about foreign, versus internal agents in a community, that which is inside the community, that which is outside. And I think she will also be talking about American politics to some degree. So I'd love to see what Sarah has in store for us. Please, Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, there's going to be a lecture, I guess, about the scapegoat in American politics, followed by a short clip of one of my songs, actually, that deals with it. I'll be sharing my screen for that part.
I can't wait. Thank you.
So, from René Girard, The Scapegoats, page 41. In so-called ethnological societies, the presence of an epidemic immediately arouses a suspicion that there has been an infraction of the basic rules of the community. We are not permitted to call such societies primitive. The first sign that COVID-19 had affected the American psyche was not people suddenly dying, not people mysteriously getting sick, but the violent attacks on Asian immigrants and their descendants. The news reports, to the extent that people paid attention to them, said the virus came out of China. They weren't blaming Chinese, just saying facts. The news stories placing blame would come later. Donald Trump, our president at the time, and despised by about half the population, infamous for saying the quiet part out loud when it came to the ethnic prejudices of his voter base, called it the China virus. But the attacks weren't being carried out by his voter base. They are mostly carried out by Black people in large cities against their Asian neighbors, same people targeted without media or presidential priming in the LA riots. Maybe that should have been a sign, but it wasn't. I, like most people knowing Trump's voter base, was determined to not place blame on anyone. We rightfully decried the attacks on Asians and the crazed fear and need to punish that gave birth to them. So irrational, we said, so primitive. The behavior of the Trump voter base, not something we do. If I had not lived alone in 2020, if I'd been able to get my needs met by dinner every night with a spouse or a roommate/best friend or a family that didn't want to fuck me, would I have joined in the persecuting crowd instead of becoming its target? I was in the right demographic for it, the people that despise Trump, that believe themselves well-read, rational, free from prejudice. The news stories placing blame came in a rapid wave. It was all the fault of those young people who wanted to party, go to bars, have spring break, be with other young people. We knew early on the old were the primary victims of the virus, but the young weren't being blamed for visiting their grandparents. They were blamed for congregating in large numbers, whether they ended up going back to a multi-generational home or a one-person studio apartment. They were blamed for having too much fun. In the summer, it became okay briefly to gather in large numbers, if you could say you were doing it because Black Lives Matter, but gathering for fun was still forbidden. News media displayed stories about the difficulties family had in raising kids at home. Social media became filled with images of bread baking and cute domestic crafts. Single people became invisible. Unnoticed by society, they died. Drug overdose deaths increased by 31% from 2019 to 2020, but that wasn't the kind of CDC data that made for news anymore. San Francisco locked down first, then LA, then most of the rest of the country. The business and school shutdowns came first and last longest in the areas that hated Trump the most progressive areas. Why? I couldn't believe it was because they cared more. That maybe explained the business shutdowns, but didn't explain the school closures, which shut down children's learning for an entire year. It also didn't explain the memes I was seeing online. Anti-lockdown protesters portrayed as hordes of raging zombies, people telling their friends that if they wanted to visit in person, they were selfish murderers who didn't deserve to have friendships. It didn't explain the Harmon Kane Award forum on Reddit, where members openly cheered at other people's deaths from disease. It wasn't until I started reading Girard that I started to get it. Girard's theory in brief: when psychological tensions in a community became too much to bear, they focus on a single sacrificable person, someone without strong family ties who can be killed without repercussions, and destroy this person completely. This is the ritual that dispels plagues and restores internal peace. Quote, René Girard, Violence and the Sacred, page 12. If we look at the extremely wide spectrum of human victims sacrificed by various societies, the list seems heterogeneous to see in the least. It includes prisoners of war, slaves, small children, unmarried adolescents, and the handicapped. It ranges from the dregs of society, such as the Greek pharmakos, to the king himself. Is it possible to detect a unifying factor in this disparate group? We notice at first glance beings who are either outside or on the fringes of society, prisoners of war, slaves, pharmakos, exterior or marginal individuals. Their status as foreigners or enemies, their serve-out condition, or simply their age prevents these future victims from fully integrating themselves into the community. But what about the king? Is he not at the very heart of the community? Undoubtedly, but it's precisely his position at the center that serves to isolate him from his fellow men, to register him casteless. Since the American and French revolutions, the king has become much more sacrificable. Here in the US, we have elections to depose them, impeachment hearings to publicly humiliate them, and a justice system that in theory could put them in jail. Like every other progressive, I was convinced up to 2019 that all these things would happen before Trump got to run for office again. Robert Mueller would save us. Patriotic Republicans would join Democrats in ousting the foreign puppet. Trump would disappear and politics would go back to normal. But Trump stayed put, and the stage was set among my former friends to go after smaller targets. As for the Trump voter base, turns out they're not that different from us. While we followed the Russiagate hearings, they followed the mysterious online figure QAnon. What QAnon said was that Trump would save us. The pedophiles in high places would all be arrested at once. Everyone in the Epstein network would be locked up and life would go back to normal. But Epstein died in his jail cell and only one of his associates was tried, and Trump left office in 2021 without having done anything about it. And the stage was set to go after smaller targets. Accusations of trans people, quote unquote, grooming children came onto social media in a rapid wave. Florida passed a Don't Say Gay bill. Various locales started banning LGBT books. No doubt it is because they care. I'm gonna share my screen here.
Please.
Wait just a sec, sorry.
Good, we're seeing it.
So that was a clip from as yet unreleased song to be released very soon. I will let you guys know another life called Vulnerable that I composed over the period from 2020 to 2022.
Does that conclude your presentation?
That concludes my presentation. Thanks very much for listening.
Amazing. That's fascinating. I really appreciate the energy and the yeah, thank you for sharing it, for being creative. It's always very fun and interesting to see how people interpret this call to present some work. And it's always fun when people, present untraditional or unorthodox mixes of content and different media. So thank you for that. That's fascinating. A lot to chew on there. Okay. All right. It's a tough act to follow, but I'm going to nonetheless force someone to carry on this group discussion. So I think next up, in no order, let's just go with Michael Morris. Michael, if you're with us, Michael Morris will be speaking about liberalism, Christian revelation, and I think he has a more elaborate thesis around, you know, the myth of the victim and the persecutor, how these two are tangled up in kind of the liberal political consciousness. I hope I'm not doing a disservice to that. We'll see what he has to say in his own words. Michael, take it away. Oh, I guess I should have confirmed that Michael is in the room, which I did not think to do. I was assuming that everyone was here, but now that I look, it is possible that Michael is not with us. So, okay, fair enough. My bad. I should have thought of that. All right, we'll see if Michael joins us, and if not, hey, that's all right. Let's go to Jack Noble. So, Jack Noble is going to be talking about Girard's thought in relation to game theory. So yet another interesting and somewhat surprising or just intriguing kind of cross-disciplinary pollination here. So I'm very intrigued to hear what Jack has to say about Girard and game theory. Jack, please go ahead.
Thanks, Justin. So I have slides also, but they look much worse. So just like super brief intro on game theory, it is the study of mathematical models of strategic interactions between rational agents. And I felt like this came up again and again and again, and I was sort of surprised to see that there didn't seem to be existing literature talking about this. But it is something that's been applied to a bunch of sort of Girard adjacent fields: social contract theory, evolution of altruism, international relations, etc. And it is sort of fundamentally other regarding because in order to make the right strategic decision, you have to be thinking about what the other players are going to do. And so sort of most famously, the game that gets talked about the most is this prisoner's dilemma game, where you have two prisoners and they can cooperate by remaining silent or defect by confessing. And an interesting dynamic here is that both players are incentivized to defect. They'll, no matter what the other player does, they'll do better if they defect. But because of that, you sort of end up in this perverse situation where they're incentivized to defect, but that is worse than if they were to both cooperate and remain silent. And so there's this book in 1984 called The Evolution of Cooperation by Robert Axelrod. And the idea is that by modeling society and evolution as playing games like The Prisoner's Dilemma over and over again in time, we can explain how cooperating came to exist. So if you only play once, you're kind of screwed in The Prisoner's Dilemma because you're always going to want to defect. But over time, you can incentivize the other players to cooperate. And the idea also is that sort of the strategies that make sense here also make sense when extrapolated to more dynamic games that have multiple players, games with uncertainty, etc. And so he ran a tournament where game theorists submitted strategies for playing this game of iterated Prisoner's Dilemma, where the strategies go up against each other, and then you sort of total up the scores at the end and see what wins. And so there is a winner in this tournament, and the strategy is called tit for tat, which is where you cooperate if the player that you're playing against previously cooperated in the last turn, and you defect if they defected. So interesting thing here is that this strategy is literally mimesis. It's just copying what the other player did. And so you can sort of see how this parallels Girard's account of formation of societies being strictly about mimesis. There's another interesting feature of the strategy, which is that if you add uncertainty or noise to the game, so a side thinks that they cooperated, but they actually defected, you can end up in this crazy cycle where when tit for tat is playing itself, it will just defect again and again and again at itself, and you end up in this cycle of violence. So, right, this is parallels Girard's concept of cycle of violence. And reality is sort of much worse than this very simplified game. Not just because of uncertainty, but also because there's visibility into what strategies you're pursuing. So if you're willing to, say, not punish someone who defects against you by titting their cat, then you incentivize them to defect against you. You incentivize anyone watching to defect against you in the future. And if you have allies, which is sort of common into this Girardian picture, you demonstrate that you can't be trusted to keep those agreements because you've sort of abandoned this tit for tat that leads to the cycle for violence. And so, like, I sort of see the Scapegoat in Girard as this kind of brilliant game theoretic strategy where all the parties to the conflict misapprehend who is responsible for defecting, and they all turn on a party that isn't capable of retaliating and sort of pretend that this party is responsible for all of the defecting that happened. And this lets them end the cycle of violence because, like, the party will be destroyed and they won't be able to retaliate. But it lets them do it in a way that preserves the deterrence effect of retaliation, because they can say they did retaliate against the responsible party, even though they in fact didn't. And this matches Girard's account because it will stop working once the pattern is seen as very common and visible to anyone watching, because if you know that this is what someone's doing, it doesn't work to maintain that deterrence effect. So could like go into other examples of this, but suffice to say, I think that there's like an interesting way of reading Girard, which is as sort of a historian and prognosticator on the human metagame. And I think you can pull more things from game theory as sort of technologies for avoiding Girardian pessimism too.
Does that conclude, Jack?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah, that's really interesting. It sounds like you're basically saying that both Christianity and the Scapegoat strategy are both kind of sensible equilibria. It's basically a multiple equilibria problem where a society can converge on either one, and either one can work for a certain amount of time to different degrees. They both make a certain amount of rational sense, but they're different ways for a society to process that in ways that are kind of game theoretically, that they're both game theoretically plausible or sustainable to some degree. But they're just different equilibria, something like that.
Yes, something like that. Although if you get into the literature, the strategy that looks like Christianity ends up running into problems when you go against sort of evil strategies that are going to defect all the time, because Christianity likes to forgive, and you can exploit that by defecting against Christianity repeatedly.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Maybe we can pick that up in the final discussion after everyone's gone. So thanks so much, Jack. A lot of food for thought there. I really appreciate it. And once again, just bringing in more unexpected kind of multiple disciplinary kind of vectors inward into this discussion is absolutely fascinating. So, all right, awesome. Let's carry on then, shall we? So next up, let's go to, let me first confirm that they're here with us. Josepha. How about you, Josepha? Would you like to take your turn now? Josepha will talk about mimetic desire, not from the perspective of anthropology or history, but from the perspective of human development. That is to say, over the span of a single lifetime. So very interesting. I think she's going to talk about infant behavior and some other topics. So please, Josepha, take it away.
Hi, thank you. Okay, so I have some slides. Let me see. Oh my God, I haven't shared my screen in like over a year. I don't even know what I'm looking at.
Should be fine. Down at the bottom, there's a little green button. You see share screen.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm like choosing the okay, Opera. That's my browser.
Do you have? Is there going to be an audio component or no?
Oh no. Okay, it's not showing thumbnails for the preview, so hopefully I don't have pull up anything embarrassing here when I. Okay. Allow. Okay. Oh, I have to do system preferences.
That's right.
Oh. Sorry, so I can make me put in my password.
No worries. It's all good. We got plenty of time.
Oh, okay. I think I have to quit Zoom for some reason.
Okay,
It's
no problem. I tell you what, you take your time.
reopen.
Yeah, Josepha, you take your time and get that sorted, and we'll go to the next person, and then you can go after that person. Okay.
Okay, thanks so much.
No problem. Go ahead and
Hopefully I'll
do
be
whatever
ready
you need
for
to.
when I-
Yeah, do whatever you need to do. Cool. Alrighty. That means next up is Joe Oswald, who is here with us today. So that's good. Joe's going to talk about how Girard's ideas explain the paradox of contemporary economic stagnation in an era when innovation as an idea commands near unanimous approval. So very interesting topic in Girard, this question of innovation. So please, Joe, take it away. I'm very, very intrigued to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Justin. Yeah. So I want again, kind of going back to in the first week, we looked at that paper of Girard's on innovation, and I guess my introduction really to Girard was through Thiel and this idea of us being in an era of stagnation now, and this kind of paradox that we talk a lot about how dynamic the economy is, how Silicon Valley is the archetype of the modern economy, and there's innovation everywhere. And yet, in the statistics, economic growth has been much slower since around the 70s. And if you just look at how different it feels to live through a period of the last 50 years in comparison to the 50 years before that, the transformation of the physical world is much smaller now. So I think it's reasonable then to say that there is this paradox where we're in an era where there's much less innovation economically than there has been, even while we talk as if there's all this innovation. And this, to stick with Girard, this really matters if you believe in Peter Thiel's idea that one of the consequences of economic growth is that it is an outlet for the dangerous mimetic energy that builds up, because you have people competing for different things. And as long as you're growing the total amount available for everyone, that's manageable in even with mimetic processes. So I want to first just briefly talk about public choice economics, which is, I think, gives kind of the clearest explanation for what is going on, why there is this stagnation. And I would say the simplest explanation for what that theory is it applies the regular understanding of economics back onto governance, basically onto the rules of the game of capitalism. So instead of just describing how agents act within a market, it describes how the rules of the market are set. And there's this interesting line Girard has in his piece on innovation that he talks about innovation being the only real source of profit. And I think it's true that it's the only legitimate source of profit, but there are illegitimate sources of profit, basically monopolization and restricting competition. And so, some examples that public choice people talk about is if you make it very hard to become a doctor or become a lawyer, or you set it so that you need a university degree to get all kinds of jobs, that restricts the supply and that harms innovation and causes certain people to become rich at the expense of others. So I think an important thing to understand in economics is this resistance to innovation that exists, basically this monopolizing tendency. And within economics, the explanation always relies on these kind of rational actors understanding and calculating what they can do to get ahead, which doesn't feel like it quite matches up to how people behave and how passionate people get at, when it comes to blocking these other forms of innovation. And so I want to really extend, the list of analogies of examples of sacrifice to, there are a great list of, what I want to put forward as examples of sacrifice in the book Why Nations Fail by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. And they talk about early innovations failing. There was a early prototype of a steamship invented in Germany that was smashed to pieces by people who hated it. There were the Luddites, of course, who deliberately smashed technologies, and more recent protests against Uber, I think, would fit into this kind of example of trying to make a sacrifice of new technology and perhaps of the innovators of that technology. And I want to lean on an idea in Girard that often it is when people are worried about sameness, they attack difference, because within their own tribe, there is people want to feel like they're not all the same, but a real outsider shows up how small the differences are between the members of that tribe. And so a common reaction in the face of this is to attack that outsider and sacrifice that outsider, and then hide the real example of them being an example of difference, and thereby feel that there is more difference again within the actual tribe. So I want to basically offer that Girardian sacrifice mechanism as a slightly more psychologically rigorous explanation for why there is this incredibly powerful tendency in the economy to react violently against innovation and stamp down against innovation. And I think that's about 5 minutes. So I will.
Okay. Excellent. That was fascinating, Joe. Kind of similar to Jack's talk in bringing in, the social sciences and a more kind of rational choice perspective. So that's absolutely fascinating to see that emerging as a kind of one common strand in these discussions. Is very, very interesting. I would not have necessarily expected half of the group to go in that direction, but it's very rich, and I think it's a very promising set of inquiries that you all have started in this area, in this style. Same goes for the literary approaches. It's just that's more to be expected. So yeah, this is shaping up to be a really eclectic and fascinating group of conversations, and I'm glad that we'll have lots of time to talk, because I have some questions and I want to prod some people here to cross-pollinate some of these discussions even more. I want to kind of hear some of the more literary angles, interact a little bit more with some of the more rational choice angles here. I think there's some really interesting questions I have for you all, so I'm excited to get to that. But without further ado, we still have one person, at least one person, if I'm not mistaken, who needs to present. So Josefa, hopefully now your computer is all ready. So
I hope so.
To reintroduce Josefa. So Josefa Westerman is going to be talking today about not anthropology or history, but human development more generally, and the span of a single lifetime rather than long-term historical change. And I think she's going to be talking about infant behavior, especially, among other things. So please, Josefa, take it away.
Hi. Okay, so I think this is looking a little more promising with the screen sharing. Let's see.
Great.
This looks right. Okay. So let's go on slideshow. Okay, so this title is a mouthful, but basically I finished a master's in developmental psych like a year ago. And I found throughout the Girard course that I was sort of reminded of, famous infant experiments, and specifically the work of a researcher named Andrew Meltzoff, who's researched since the 70s. I think he's still working today, but his basically entire career has been focused on imitation, specifically in infants, very young infants, and in fact, younger than we used to think infants were capable of imitating. So this is Andrew Meltzoff, the guy, not the baby. And he, this was his breakthrough paper in 1977. Basically, the reason that this was such a breakthrough was that in the estimation of Freud and also Jean Piaget, who I don't know if you guys are familiar, but he's basically the biggest developmental theorist of the 20th century. And the thought up until the 70s was that imitation was something that we would see in infants around the year mark, around 8 to 12 months. And that, prior to that, infants are essentially without a social mind, you might say. I mean, we might picture the sort of quintessential like Freudian infant is kind of in this egocentric world where it's him and his mother's breasts is maybe the most that he's aware of. And Meltzoff's work kind of blew this out of the water because he was able to find that infants are able to imitate as early as, in this paper, he found 12 to 21 day old infants. Can, you know, when you stick your tongue out, they can stick their tongue out. When you open your mouth, they open their mouths, etc. And this also, you know, you talk about psychology, people bring up the replication crisis. These findings were actually incredibly well replicated. They happen to be a behavioral experiment, I think, because it's easy to replicate. It was replicated many times over the following decade by Meltzoff and others. And in fact, they were able to find even earlier evidence of infant imitation. I believe that the earliest they were able to do it was in a study in 1983. They had an infant that was 42 minutes old imitate facial expressions. So at that point, you're really at 42 minutes, like I think the limiting factor really is like cleaning the infant off after it's like been born. So it's, I think if there's anything that we could describe as like innate human capability, it's imitation. And, you know, so I found this really interesting that not only was he studying imitation, mimesis, right concurrent to Girard's work, but that it was sort of coming along to a lot of the similar conclusions concerning like the innateness of or fundamental nature of imitation to human social relationships. And so actually, while I was putting together this presentation, I did a little bit of Googling, and in fact, Meltzoff contributed a chapter to a Girardian mimetic studies volume. So I just want to emphasize that I'm not reinventing the wheel here. I'm not the first person to notice the connection between Meltzoff and Girard. I think Meltzoff is aware of and influenced by Girard's work. So yeah, sorry, and I'm sorry if I'm going over time. From the research, Meltzoff developed the like me hypothesis, is what it's called. Essentially, because, okay, we can tell that infants are able to connect their own acts, like sticking out one's tongue, to others' acts. That's how they're able to imitate. They're able to associate your sticking out your tongue with their sticking out their tongue. Therefore, infants are also able to associate their internal mental state, what it feels like to stick out one's tongue, with their external mental state, sticking out one's tongue. And because of that, we can infer that infants can project their internal mental state onto other people's internal mental state because they're able to make these relationships. So they can associate the sensation, what it feels like to stick out their own tongue, with that of the other person, you know, sticking out their tongue, what it feels like for them. That is to say that our ability to imitate actually precedes our theory of mind. That the birth of our social minds is actually comes out of this ability to imitate, and not, as Freudian theorists had thought prior to this, the other way around, where we, you know, have emergent social abilities and then are able to imitate based off of that. So this is actually to have a big block quote in here, but I found it interesting that he kind of lapses into a Girardian language here, where he, talking about the like me situation, says neonates, newborns enjoy something like a social garden of Eden. That is the caretaker, the mother, and them like paying attention to and imitating each other. But the disturbance to this Eden is that they become aware that their caretakers sometimes attend to third parties or inanimate objects. So you can see, I think, where we're going with this, and that is the dynamic of mimetic desire, which is then we'll get into now a experiment in the 90s also of Meltzoff's, where things get really interesting. Oh, here we go. Okay, so this is an illustration from a paper that describes what Meltzoff calls the behavioral reenactment procedure. Basically, experiments on infants is really difficult because, of course, they're pre-verbal. So you have to make sort of these elaborate procedures in order to be able to like infer their mental states, because they can't describe them to you, obviously. So one of these procedures is, we know that infants, again, have like a capacity, not only capacity, but they like to imitate adults or imitate people they're interacting with, rather. So one method that they've designed is you take a toy, and this is a novel toy that's constructed for the purposes of the experiment. It's not something that the infant could have possibly been familiar with prior to that, which is important. In this case, in this example, the toy, and pay attention also only to the upper 4 diagrams here. You take a toy and this is for, in this example, this is like a dumbbell with 2 blocks on either end of a stick. And the block actually can come off of the stick, like the block on one end, it can come, the toy comes apart. So the adult experimenter takes the toy, he attempts to remove the one part of the dumbbell, and he, pretends like, oh, he can't quite grasp it. He can't quite finish the task, and he doesn't pull the dumbbell apart, but he's attempted to do it. You hand that same toy to an 18-month-old infant, and the infant is able to, having watched that, pulls the toy apart easily and goes like, see, what, this is easy, why didn't you do this? Implying that the infant is able to infer from that incompleted action the goal or intention, or one might say the desire of the adult that they were imitating, and pull apart the toy, even though they didn't have that behavior explicitly demonstrated to them. So, and then this bottom diagram is actually showing that when you replicate this with a robot or with like a puppet, that is to say, like without a person, the infant actually has no interest in doing the same thing, in pulling apart the toy. They specifically have like a human intersubjective relationship where they are able to infer other people's desire and also like take on that desire for themselves and take apart a toy. Again, this is seen like pretty consistently with 18-month-olds. I think they see it even with infants younger than that, 14 or 12 months on occasion. So yeah, I mean, this is basically the final point of the talk, but it's to my knowledge, the very earliest that in a human's lifetime that we can see evidence of like mimetic desire, basically. Yeah, and I think that this is like one more perhaps like piece of evidence that like mimetic desire is the basis for our social minds, like not only evolutionarily, on the scale like Sean talked about of hominization coming from primates to humans and whatever point in the process that entails, but even in the process of like going from a newborn infant into an adult, it comes like before language, basically, and it's one of the first social acts that we can do. So yeah, that's talk.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Josepha. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe everyone who had an abstract submitted who wanted to speak today was able to speak so far. Just to be extra sure though, I'm not skipping anyone, am I? Is there anyone here who is intending to give a presentation who was not asked to speak? Did I miss anyone or forget anyone? Just want to double check. Okay, cool. So that was amazing. Really, really interesting talks. I'm really impressed by just the diversity of them and the kind of independence of mind, the creativity of these talks, and how they all just come from very different idiosyncratic directions that are clearly driven by unique personal interests and perspectives. And so it was a great joy to listen to them, quite frankly, and I took a lot of notes. What I want to do now, since we have, more than 40 minutes, really, we don't have to spend all of that time, but we have it if we'd like to. I'd like to just facilitate a little bit of discussion around some of the ideas and questions that came up in this kind of rapid fire series of short talks. And I want to kind of just prod you all to to think about some things and to possibly, talk about some things together, because probably the value add that I can bring to the table right now is just the benefit of having a third party, who has not been in the trenches with you all. You all have been talking for many weeks now. You all have got to know each other. You probably, when you talk about things for weeks on end in a small group, it can be an amazingly productive time. But one of the drawbacks sometimes is you get into certain groups, right? You get into certain grooves of thought, and maybe it's sometimes beneficial to have a third party come from out of the blue, give a listen to what the group is producing, and perhaps the unique value I can add, if any at all, is just to play that kind of third party observer, the impartial person hearing all of this stuff for the first time. And possibly I can identify some interesting threads of inquiry that are germane to all of you, or a few of you at a time, that perhaps were kind of hidden or not totally visible to you all when you were kind of in the trenches figuring out your ideas and perspectives. So I'm going to try to play that role in the next 40 minutes. You can tell me if I'm successful or not, but that's what I'm going to try to do. And so I want to just make a few comments, but interpret these as general prompts and discussion points. I want you all to kind of contribute here as well. So one thing that comes to me listening to all these talks is that there is this kind of conventional cartoonish version of René Girard that I think most people have in their minds if they've heard of René Girard, but maybe have not spent much time with his texts, which is the cartoon version being that mimetic desire is just this unadulterated bad thing, right? It brainwashes us, it forces us into conflict, and everyone nowadays who knows anything about Girard wants to be anti-mimetic, right? This is kind of the fashionable posture today. If you're in circles where Girard is known or appreciated or respected, everyone wants to be anti-mimetic, everyone wants to be contrarian, right? And generally, mimesis and mimetic desire is seen as a generally negative thing. But one of the things that comes out of your talks today that really struck me was how actually, very often in some ways, mimetic desire is good, actually. Seems to be one of the interesting threads that I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily understand or appreciate if they didn't really, spend several weeks reading these texts. And so this is something I want to pause on and kind of ask you all about. So you kind of see this in your talks today from a few perspectives, right? Like Alex's first presentation today, when Alex was talking about the question of romantic love from a Girardian perspective, even went as far as to say that, mimetic desire is good in and of itself, and it's the basis of love. It's only that it has certain pitfalls, or it can fall into certain traps. But Alex went as far as to say that in and of itself, a mimetic desire is essentially a good thing as the basis of romantic love. Josepha just now in her presentation was basically talking about how it's the mimetic desire is arguably the basis of learning. It's the reason why infants can learn so much so fast. If you've ever watched an infant develop, they're just absorbing at this kind of insanely exponential rate. And arguably one implication or possible hypothesis based on Josepha's talk is that really mimetic desire is the engine of the profound and fast-paced learning rate that infants enjoy. But also in other ways, like in Jack's presentation, looking at Girard from a game theoretic perspective, Jack sees a certain kind of social scientific sensibility, or a kind of reasonableness, if you will, to mimetic desire. Jack says that it's essentially it is a reasonable and kind of effective, if limited, but nonetheless relatively effective strategy for fomenting cooperation. Basically, it's if you think of mimetic desire as tit for tat, that actually kind of works quite well from one perspective. If someone is bad to you, you be bad to them in return. If someone is good to you, you be good to them in return. That there's a certain plausibility and social sensibility to that actually works compared to some other more harmful strategies. And so there are probably a few other kind of comments or ideas that were floated by other people in this panel today that also kind of go in that direction. So I want to talk about this a little bit. I want to invite you all to maybe say a little bit more about this, or perhaps you can comment on each other's talks and what you've learned from each other. Is mimetic desire just generally today underrated? Is it overly stigmatized? Is mimetic desire actually much better than in general? It's a force for more good than people realize, and it's kind of villainized and stigmatized more than it should be. Do you agree with this diagnosis? Am I onto something? Do you want to add to this? Does anyone want to kind of comment on each other's talks or what you learned in this direction? Just an open prompt to talk about this, because I thought it was an interesting thing that emerged from many of you.
Do you mind if I just follow up? And
Of course.
I mean, yeah, I like this point you bring up, Justin. I mean, the thing that the reading we did that it most clearly links to, I would say, is the one that Jack brought up, which is it was Joe, I believe, who brought up the innovation text. And, you know, what's interesting there, which you find kind of scattered around some other texts by Girard, and this relates to what, Justin, you know, you pointed out in a kind of ironic fact, which is that, you know, it's now fashionable to be sort of anti-mimetic or to kind of fetishize, you know, the kind of, you know, eschewing of mimesis, which of course itself becomes a kind of hypermimetic phenomenon, right? Because it's you know, once something is fashionable, it's being mimetically transmitted. And so the paradox there is that, you know, the attempt to avoid mimesis can lead to its own, you know, it can lead to its replication, you know, which is interesting in relation to the essay on innovation, because part of the point there is sort of that, you know, modern people's, you know, refusal or refusal of the idea of imitation as a valuable practice, right? That, you know, people in earlier times and other civilizations, you know, basically understood and centered imitation, you know, as a fundamental aspect of, you know, arts, culture, and so on. And, you know, whereas, you know, modern people tend to look down upon imitation and fetishize innovation, but this merely kind of traps them in even more sterile forms of imitation because they're premised on this kind of denial of it, that it's even happening, right? And so, I mean, there, you know, I think that paradox can then kind of reproduce itself in some of the ways that Girard's thought itself is kind of made use of, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think this whole question, which we've touched upon in several ways, you know, is kind of this question of what, and I think Girard gives a few different answers in different places, and they can kind of open out in different directions. But, you know, how can we define the sort of positive dimensions of mimesis and even mimetic desire? And how can we articulate what those are in relation to, you know, the more, you know, destructive forms that it may take. So, you know, that's, I just wanted to appreciate your commentary and also kind of just tie it back to some other things we've read and a question that I think has come up a number of times in the course of the discussions. So
Excellent.
I will here cede the floor to whoever would like to, you know, just follow up in whatever way.
Thanks, Jeff. That's great.
I don't buy that mimesis is unfashionable. I mean, maybe in the tech world, it's like innovate, 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 when really they're doing kind of very small changes. But like certainly in the arts world, you know, like we have these endless like Marvel movies, Star Wars, all these repurposing of older properties. You see a lot of cultural nostalgia loops. I'm not convinced that mimesis is in fact unfashionable at all in our current moment, like outside the tech world.
Well, I think that kind of depends on what you define as fashion. I think among like mainstream cultural currents, you're definitely right. But if we, I think for people who, much like all of us, probably like consider themselves above the Marvel movies, this is like the tier of thinker in the social hierarchy that is extremely anti-mimesis. So you may argue that, you know, to take a fashion metaphor, those are, you know, the Marvel movie admirers are the ones wearing the skinny cut jeans and
right. No, it's a great point, Sarah. You're definitely onto something that you know, much of culture absolutely capitulates to a kind of mimetic standard, a mimetic default, and actually many people are quite content with kind of mimetic default. So you're absolutely right. Yeah, and I think Joseph, you're also right in clarifying what I said in that, you know, when I say something's fashionable, I really mean it's the high status opinion among a relatively, you know, narrow set of supposed sophisticates, right? Whoever is in that class or not doesn't really matter. I say that with scare quotes because it's a bit absurd, but every society has, you know, kind of high status kind of minority opinion, what's fashionable and cool in those circles, right? Versus the rest of people. So I think that is, I think you're both correct. Any other thoughts on this larger question of, you know, is mimetic desire in general over stigmatized? Would you agree with that? Are we at a point where we can say that, where, like, you know, people who like to bandy about Girardian concepts, do you agree with this kind of provocation that in general mimetic desire across the board gets a bad rap, and actually it's on average a force for more good than people want to admit? Or is all of its kind of negative stigmatization equally deserved, and that's, so you wouldn't say that it's kind of underrated?
I think to stick on the question of the Marvel films, and that there's you can say their massive success is also a failure of the other more elite, you know, side of the film world. There were times when you know, there was more of a crossover, better films were more popular as well, and that's what I wanted to get to at the end of the piece I was talking about, and I just kind of ran out of my 5 minutes. But there's a so I think drawing on that Girard innovation article, he kind of draws this dichotomy between the arts and business is extremely interested in shallow internal mediation, and the arts is extremely interested in rejecting that. And he kind of sees these as both failure models, both failure modes. And there's a really interesting piece by the film critic Pauline Kael that I wanted to get in at the very end of this, that she talks about in the 60s and 70s, a lot of filmmakers who were exactly making that failure of trying to reject everything that had come before. And so they were sort of destroying their ability to really innovate in a productive way. And comparing that to a kind of first generation of kind of 70s rebel filmmakers who were really, they were imitating much earlier filmmakers who had themselves been rebels. So there was a kind of dual thing where they were imitating, but they were imitating people who rejected a lot of imitation. And that, so it was the kind of, in a way, it goes against the idea Girard is saying at one point in that there's no innovation until you abandon external mediation, really, to put it in a sentence, I think.
Does someone want to expand on that? Or that was interesting what you just said. Could maybe you want to say a little bit more about that, Joe, or if someone wants to add to that or comment on that, what you just said, that there's no innovation until there's, what did you say?
Yeah, because I was a bit unclear maybe. I think he says that very close to the beginning of the innovation article, that, you know, he draws this distinction, external mediation, because you're then imitating someone who's, you know, something unchangeable. It's impossible in a world of external mediation to have innovation. And he does tell the story of, you know, the collapse of external mediation leading to the rise of innovation. But I wonder now, kind of, at least once we've had that, and in a way we have figures from the past who we could take as external models who were innovators themselves, you know, does that enable a kind of third way where you can more durably support innovation now? Like if you take, I don't know, Steve Jobs as your model, and he's dead and an external model, but he stood for change in a way, I suppose.
Right. So, okay, I want to ask a question of the group that I think is fun. So I'm a relatively unsophisticated third party here, right? I haven't been studying with Girard over the past several weeks as deeply as you all are. So I'm going to kind of play the role of the kind of naive outsider, maybe someone who's listening to this right now or watching this right now, you know, concretely and practically, right? If I want to have role models and learn from them and feel inspired by them and kind of follow from their successes, learn from their successes, and allow their example to inspire me and inform me and propel me, how do I actually do that in a way that doesn't fall into the trap where I'm, just enviously and kind of merely repetitively trying to kind of play out some fantasy where I am that person, right? So you just mentioned Steve Jobs. Maybe we could think of Elon Musk, right? These types of people who today are seen as role models to many, many people. They're seen as exemplars of innovation, and they're seen as exemplars of the creative vision followed by the dogged, persistence to follow through and execute on a unique, innovative vision. A lot of people see these people and they're like, okay, I want to be the next Elon Musk. I want to do something in my own way that is like similarly visionary and innovative, concretely and practically. Like, what have you all learned over the past few weeks about, like, what can you say about how to do this correctly? Like how to have role models and how to channel your mimetic desire productively without falling into its traps. Like, what would you tell? What are some insights or non-obvious lessons you've learned in the past few weeks that you could share with someone coming to the table with this kind of practical question? Don't be shy.
So I think it has to do with staying differentiated from the model that you are mimicking, which can mean different things. But what you don't want is a situation where you build a successful tech company and then all of a sudden you are directly competing with Steve Jobs, or worse, like trying to take his job at Apple or something. So like one option is just to pick people who are very far away in space and time that you won't come into competition with. Another option might be to conceive of the way you are imitating them as sort of orthogonal to the domain that they actually succeeded at. So right, like if you are a writer, but you are imitating Einstein in some way, like maybe that lets you escape sort of the eventual slide into internal mimesis.
Okay, interesting. That's a plausible hypothesis to me. You're basically saying, kind of mimic by analogy or something like that. Don't try to, if you want to be inspired and learn by Elon Musk and learn the lessons of Elon Musk, then it's like, be like the Elon Musk of bloggers or YouTubers or something like that, but don't try to go build a rocket company. If you try to build, if you're inspired by Elon Musk and you set out to, be a successful, rocket entrepreneur, then you've fallen into the trap. But if you can be inspired and just take those lessons and take that inspiration and that mimetic desire and do something totally different in a different domain, but almost by analogy, following your exemplar, then that would be healthy. That sounds like a plausible hypothesis and makes a lot of sense. Anyone else have anything on this?
I think.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you go.
Okay. Sorry. In my mind, the thing with imitation is in imitating someone, you're not replicating exactly what they've done because it's you that's imitating it. So if anything, I think that the sort of pathology of mimetic desire arises in this kind of relationship in cases where like there's sort of this like neurosis about being imitative and having to distinguish oneself. And if anything, you see it, we've sort of commented on this in class occasionally in Girard's relationship to Freud. And I'm not saying that Girard secretly agrees with Freud, but he is sometimes so, emphatic in his distaste for some parts of Freudian theory that you can tell that there's the sort of resentment of the pupil under the master in a way. Not that I would consider Girard Freud's pupil, but to take an example. Sorry, that's all I had to say.
No, that's great. That's great. Anyone else?
I was just going to say before, I think there's some value in distinguishing between imitating ultimate goals and ends and imitating kind of techniques to get there. And the stories Girard gives where things seem to really go wrong seem to revolve around not having any fixed set of what you're aiming for in life and taking that from other people. And so I wonder if, part of the value of Christianity is that it gives you a very firm grounding on that question. And then you're free to imitate and copy when it comes to the smaller techniques of things you do in life.
Okay. Yeah, I see that too. That sounds promising as well. Any other thoughts or comments on this question?
The Steve Jobs one is interesting because it makes me think of Elizabeth Holmes, how sort of, she had made
Right.
him her idol and that she like wanted to mimic him, but she only sort of acquired these very superficial similarities where she like literally would wear a turtleneck, or she was like, Steve Jobs is the head of a tech company, I want to be the head of a tech company. And it was very much about acquisition. So yeah, just going off of what Joe just said, like as opposed to mimicking someone based on results, mimicking technique. Was she doing the same amount of like obscure, coding work that Steve Jobs was doing? Probably not. Like, definitely not, right? Because she started
Yeah.
with an end product that she was selling without having actually done the work to make sure that it could function.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That I think you're onto something there. That sounds accurate to me. You made me think, Jessica, of another interesting recent pop cultural kind of case study or exemplar, which is, how many of you are familiar with the story of Adam Newman and WeWork? If you know anything about his personal life, and in fact, there's a mini series, like a TV show on, I think it's on Apple Plus is where I watched it recently. It's called We Crashed. It's with it stars Jared Leto playing Adam Newman, and Anne Hathaway playing his partner and wife. Anyway, it's very interesting, actually, now that I think about it from a Girardian perspective, because they were both, very visionary types of people, very high openness personalities. And if you don't know the basic TLDR of the WeWork story, is, he's a very charismatic entrepreneur who's very good at fundraising and motivating large numbers of people, spiritually and emotionally, and basically got his company WeWork up to like a $47 billion valuation. And it crashed because a lot of it was like overly hyped and badly managed, and so it crashed. It's still a company today, but it's only like 4 billion or something like that today. And so but one of the things you learn from the story of his life, and this is one of the big things dramatized in the miniseries We Crashed. It's really quite worth watching. I think it's kind of goofy or corny in certain ways, but it's pretty entertaining and pretty interesting from a Girardian perspective, because basically he and his wife had this intense mimetic rivalry. Essentially, they were very competitive, and she was constantly kind of like Madame Bovary, like comparing herself unfavorably to him and feeling like inadequate. But he very much like needed her. He really needed her, support and encouragement, and her confidence in him was a necessary ingredient for his insane confidence, which was driving the whole thing. But she was constantly feeling inadequate compared to him, and her kind of resentment towards his success was one of the things that drove her to be ever more encouraging of him emotionally and spiritually. So it's a very fascinating real world example of, both the positives and the negatives of intense mimetic desire. So just throwing that out there for anyone who might be interested in studying that. Okay, great. So any other thoughts on this particular topic? You can circle back to it at any time. We can shift gears at any time. But another question I might have, or a kind of observation on the group at large today, is that, probably one of the most striking kind of high level aspects of today's panel discussion is the diversity of kind of disciplinary perspectives that have been brought to bear today. And so about half of you kind of approached Girard from a literary perspective. And of course, Girard is kind of mostly well known as essentially a kind of literary critic, someone who dabbles in kind of anthropological ideas and philosophical ideas and other social sciences, but really his bread and butter in terms of his professional training and image, I think for most of his life, it's fair to say, he's essentially primarily a literary critic. But a lot of you, about half of you here, brought a very social scientific perspective to the table, whether it's Joe talking about public choice economics, or Jack talking about game theory, and also Sean, who I think left, he had to run, but talking about primatology and all of that. Not to mention Josepha as well, who had a kind of social science background as well. I was very intrigued by this, and so I just want to kind of hear you talk about this more. I want to hear, I'm curious, because there's probably not like a single university in the country, let alone a there's probably not an undergrad program or a PhD program in the country where you're going to hear, half of the room presenting essentially social scientific ideas from a social science perspective, and the other half of the room presenting, kind of more literary ideas from a more strictly humanities perspective. You're just not going to find that that diversity in one classroom pretty much anywhere nowadays, just because of the kind of disciplinary specialization, which is the order of the day. So it just strikes me that that's a very unique and wonderful kind of aspect of what you have here as a group. So I just want to hear people talk about this more. Like, do the people like Jessica and Sarah and those of you who have a more literary bent and bring a more kind of humanities driven angle to all of this, what do you make of the social science ideas here? What did you learn anything from the social science presentations today? Did you have questions, or can you make interesting connections between, is there something in Madame Bovary that kind of complements or supports or perhaps critiques and rejects, what public choice economics might have to say about Girard, or vice versa, for Joe and Jack and Josefa, in your perhaps greater exposure to novels and literary criticism in the past few weeks, were there interesting connections that you found in maybe Jessica's presentation or Alex's or Sarah's? I just want to kind of hear you all talk about that more. Is there something unique and perhaps original that we can say about, what Girard looks like, or what we conclude about Girard when we bring this kind of uniquely multidisciplinary kind of angle on him?
My presentation had nothing to do with literature.
Well, it was more in a humanities style than a social scientific style, is all I would say, is all I meant by that.
That's true. It was about.
It was essentially artistic. It was essentially a kind of, it was essentially a kind of.
You could say of like the personal essay kind of / music.
Yeah, that's all I meant by that. So, anything? I guess it's a bit of maybe it's too open-ended of a prompt. Maybe I can.
I want to hear from Hal, actually, because he's been all about the two cultures. So
right, that's right.
I think this is time for an impromptu Hal, 5-minute presentation.
What, like throwing?
I'm sorry, not to put you on the spot.
Throwing things. I mean, the two cultures concept as it relates to Girard. I mean, I guess like there are different ways in which both of, I mean, science seems like at one hand it's less susceptible to some of this because it's not, the research itself is not as malleable to like cultural influences or social influences, but what research areas are prioritized do. So if you see a whole bunch of people saying that we're going to research in this area, that ends up with a huge number of people, of course, going into those fields or thinking they're the most prestigious. I mean, I'm just even thinking of like, obviously, I mean, Thiel even says in his like own book that like you shouldn't try to be the next guy who does like the rocket thing or one of these other things that has been done by one of these people. You need to be the first one in this new category. And there are loads of people from all over the world going to American universities wanting to research stuff that already is kind of the hot topic in various sciences. In the humanities, people would be looking at kind of similar fields as well, or things that were influenced by these concepts. I guess just overall, my thoughts are interesting because there are ways in which the world's becoming more, I guess, homogenous in a certain way, but then also massively not so. Like the entire idea of diversity, even though like it might seem superficial to some people here, like when people talk about diversity, it is true that like culture is in a sense discussing or celebrating more different categories of people, and the whole internet is predicated towards a sort of extreme autism in a sense where people are only interested in like themselves and their very specific focuses and interests, which like no single other individual has. And this has come with a collapse of kind of these trusting society-wide mediating institutions. But
Well,
it's all
yeah.
yes.
No, that's interesting. Let me ask you a more pointed question though. I guess this is for anyone though. But Hal, maybe you could take the first stab at it. People lament the divide between the two cultures, right? This is generally articulated as a lamentation. Oh, it's so unfortunate that we have all of this disciplinary decadence. We have all of this disciplinary silo, the silos where it's so unfortunate for the progress of human knowledge that the humanities people don't talk more with the scientific people. This is generally how this kind of thing is talked about as a lament, and the implication being that if you can create cultures where these distinctions are not so rigorously maintained and enforced, and you can have scientific angles in the same room as the more literary or artistic approaches, the implication is that this should be more productive. This should be more this should be uniquely illuminating or kind of advance human knowledge in particularly promising, exciting, valuable, and value-adding ways that we can't currently access given our contemporary kind of disciplinary decadence. And so if that is the case, and as someone who's interested in the two cultures, Hal, I'm guessing that you have some sympathy for that lament. Then when it comes to Girard and when it comes to the people and the perspectives we have in this room today, what are the kind of most interesting or promising, and this is a question for all of you, what are the most interesting or promising illuminations or insights or implications that are emerging from this group's study of Girard that are kind of uniquely cross-disciplinary, or that you would not otherwise be able to tease out in a more strictly social science classroom or a more strictly humanities classroom? What are some examples? Do we see any, or what can we say about that?
I mean, I really enjoyed everyone's presentations. I'm kind of interested, just on the top of my brain, is like how this would interact with the sort of understanding of I guess rational expectations based economics, but also at what point does this become a totalitarian self-fulfilling prophecy, to the point where, I mean, all of these things are incredibly contested. They're like, economists who utilize rational expectations theory do not have a particularly great prediction record, which is actually funny compared to some others.
Right. Okay. Was that a hand up, Jack? Sure. You could just jump in.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I sort of heard Jessica's presentation as a presentation about economics. One of the other sort of game theoretic concepts I was going to get into is the tragedy of the commons, where you have like a pasture that like everyone has their cows eating from, and because no one owns the pasture, everyone is sort of incentivized to just add cows to the pasture. And this is often used as a metaphor for sort of the race to the bottom that you might see with, like, say, globalization, where countries are incentivized to lower their rules and regulations around labor practices in order to incentivize industries and corporations coming in. And I sort of see the tragedy of the common situation as a instance of undifferentiation in Girardian terms, where because there's no distinction of who owns the pasture and no one to tell anyone else how to use the pasture, everyone is sort of incentivized to compete, and because they are expecting everyone else to add cows, they sort of preemptively mimic that and add cows to the pasture themselves. And so this sort of seems analogous to the situation of gender dynamics. Once women are able to enter the workforce, you essentially double the size of the workforce, and that in theory sort of lowers the bargaining power of everyone who is working. And there have been critiques about this and the effects on families and economics. So I don't know if Justin, you hear anything there.
That's great. Did you want a direct reply, Jessica? I'm reading your comments. Jessica, the comment here that's I think most pointed and interesting on that track is Jessica says, she's talking about Illich, and she says the evolution of needs based on invidious comparison with others' aspirations. And here's the punchline, is that what is considered economic progress appears as institutional spread of triangular or mimetic desire. This is kind of similar to what Joe was saying before as well, about how, basically like in a capitalist economy, arguably innovation is the only source of profit, because given competition, all profits go to zero, is a tendency, like in any kind of capitalist system. Like once there's some source of value, everyone will just try to mimic that value until there's no gains, right? So that's like a basic tendency in any capitalist system, is for profits to have this tendency to go to zero with competition. So the only way to introduce new sources of profit is to innovate. But then the problem is that I think Jessica's talking about through Illich is that someone innovates, creates a new source of value, but then it's all immediately just mimetic or triangular desire, like sucking the life out of that value, basically. So it's like, I guess what's coming to my mind listening to you all and talking about the two cultures is it's almost like, I wonder if art and artistic creation is this kind of unique vector of innovation in society, where through the artist's creative rupture, there is actually a kind of economic dimension that makes new sources of value possible, right? But so long as like the larger bulk of just capitalist pragmatic bourgeois shopkeepers, they'll always kind of suck the value out of that down to zero. So it's like, this maybe is my hypothesis about the benefit of the two cultures coming together in this unique way, and maybe this is the kind of idea that you would not be able to surface in any other context outside of this unique multidisciplinary context we have here today, which is like, the artists, in other words, those who operate in this tendency, which we would classify as humanities or art and culture, that is kind of where the source of true innovation and true disruption is always going to come. It's going to come in this kind of intrinsically non-economic dimension of life and desire and creativity, which is essentially, it's essentially anti-economic. It's incommensurable to the economists' calculations. It comes from the outside and totally disrupts the given economic calculations of any given system. And that innovative, creative rupture that is always introduced at the level of essentially art, whether that's the performers or writers or novelists or whatever, the great philosophers who kind of tend to border on art or performance. It's always this domain of art that is the true source of innovation. And then economics, that which gets classified and measured on the economic plane, is always already in this kind of process of just sucking the value out of the innovation and watching the profits go to zero or something like that. I don't know. I'm just kind of riffing here. Is there anything to that? What do you think? Yeah.
I was going to say though, I wonder if even part of it is that makes sense, analyzing both separately, but the interaction of the two is different. And something I've even thought with, specifically with film, that it can be beneficial that like TV commercials will rip off whatever was artistically interesting in film 5 or 10 years ago, because that is, on one level it seems bad because you're taking and commercializing what was pure and interesting, but you're actually you're part of what is forcing artists to continually innovate, because you're deliberately making it so that people can't stay static and keep on doing what was cool 10 years ago, because the market has found that and got rid of any kind of alpha. So it's like a tax on not being creative, even as an artist. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's kind of what I was getting at. It's almost like, insofar as Elon Musk is a truly kind of non-mimetic type of creative visionary, in that specific dimension, he's not really acting as an economic figure or in an economic dimension. That's essentially a kind of artistic, right? It's like whatever drives Elon Musk to have these kind of unique aspirations that no one else has, essentially, that's not an economic motivation. It's not because he wants to make a lot of money that he's Elon Musk, right? He's making a lot of money because he's Elon Musk, but what makes him Elon Musk is essentially a kind of disruptive, innovative, ultimately artistic kind of disruption or artistic intervention on the world. It's one argument. So I guess this is what I'm thinking. Whereas like, you know, everyone who wants to basically just be an innovative person because they want to make money and get power and status and be respected, all of those people are only operating on essentially the economic plane. All they're really trying to do is chase profits down to zero, essentially, from an innovation that someone else already introduced.
As someone who
Yeah.
creates music, you know, like all this talk about like, you know, wanting to be the great innovator like Bill Gates or Elon Musk is kind of foreign to me, because it's like, I already write songs. I already get inspired to write songs. The inspiration comes, I write a song. I want to make those songs the best that they can be in terms of like arrangement and so on once I've written them. But the original impulse to create a song is not, it's not something that comes because I decided, oh, I want to write songs. It's something that I already do. And then it's like, how do I fit my innovativeness into the larger thing of society and sell it and get it out there and get famous and get people to want it and so on and so forth? That becomes a question. But the question of like, you know, how do I be innovative is not really the question. It's more, how do I shape the innovation into something that can then be sold once it's done?
Yeah, I think that sounds like the healthy attitude of a proper artist. So yeah, I appreciate that, and I hear what you're saying.
There's a
Um,
that
yeah.
comes to mind from Michelle Welbeck in an interview from like a decade ago, quoted Balzac's statement that the only purpose of the novel is to show the disasters produced by the changing of values. And I think that's really good because it makes me think of sort of the role of the artist is actually just to reflect the truth about the world back to the world and sort of therefore reveal it. And with regard to Girard, when we think of sort of the like chaos of the mob and the sort of mimetic violence that generates in everybody sort of sincerely concluding that a given scapegoat is responsible for, you know, whatever terror, it only works if they all are caught up in the hysteria and genuinely believe that that scapegoat is evil and or like the problem. So I think of the artist's role as sort of interrupting that and sort of putting a wedge in between that hysteria, so that reflecting back this sort of change of values and reflecting back the true nature of what's going on.
Yeah, that was beautifully put. Yeah, go ahead.
When I was first introduced to Girard, I thought he was a very pessimistic philosopher. I didn't like him at first because I thought he was basically saying that we had a choice between either, you know, scapegoating cycles or a stable hierarchy of, you know, the higher shitting on the lower. And then later when I read more of his works and talking about Christianity as an interrupting factor because you're exposing the scapegoat mechanism, I became much more positive in my view towards Girard. And I think that to me, that is the main interest and value in his work, is exposing the scapegoat system, which in fact I don't see as the chaos of the mob so much as a sinister organization that once one can see it, one cannot unsee it, and one sees the patterns everywhere. And I think that it's important that we can look across a large varieties of cultures, whether it's, you know, prehistoric times, you know, quote unquote, primitive cultures, you know, classical biblical culture, the cultures of today, both left and right and other, you know, and be able to see those mechanisms of the scapegoating dynamic in order to conquer them, so that one knows that in fact this is what people are doing. And I think that that's a very important thing to study for the health of humanity in general. So that's my primary interest.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a fascinating take as well. Folks, there's so many different directions we could go in. We're now at the 2-hour mark, so I know this is all everyone has blocked off on their calendar, so I don't want to abuse anyone's time. Yeah, there's so many more questions I could ask you all, so many different threads we could continue to pursue collectively, but we must, you know, put a bookend on this at some point or another. And this is the bookend of bookends with the very ending of the very final meeting of the seminar. So Jeff might want to say a few quick words to let you all go, but I just want to basically say a few things. One is that if anyone wants to share, like if you have websites or blogs or newsletters or whatever, or podcasts or anything like that, I'll put links to panelists in the show notes. So anyone listening to this or watching this, if you want to connect with anyone here that you listen to today, I'll ask them to share links, and I'll put those links in the description of the video. And I just want to basically thank you all for coming out. I want to thank you for your hard work. Thank you for coming on board of this seminar, but not just joining the seminar, actually, putting in the work, doing serious reading and serious thinking and reflection with each other over the course of many weeks. So I'm very grateful to have you all kind of in the community. I'm very just pleased that you all joined us, and I've been very impressed by the discussion today. Really, really high quality presentations. Clearly, you've all put a lot of work and thought into your engagements with the work of René Girard over the past several weeks with Jeff Schellenberger here. So I just want to thank you all. I'm truly grateful to have you all, contributing to the community in this way. It's been a pleasure and true delight to listen to, and I learned a lot myself today. So thank you all, and big thanks to you, Jeff, as well, for running the seminar over the past several weeks. So I think that's all from me. This has been amazing. And Jeff, I don't know if you want to say any few final words, because this will be the end of the seminar as a whole.
Yeah, mostly just to reiterate, this has been a really fantastic event. It, truly far exceeded my expectations, which were already high, because you guys have all been such great participants throughout, the past 7 weeks. And this has just been, really phenomenal sort of cross-fertilization from different disciplines, different perspectives. And I think we've all learned a great deal. So a really great culmination of the course, which has been, really a blast and a learning experience for me. And yeah, it's been really a pleasure to read all of this material with you. I hope you all stay in touch. You can always reach out to me via the Other Life forum. I'll just share my email in the chat once again for anybody who'd like to just stay in touch. And yeah, beyond that, hopefully there's sort of the course community will sort of remain intact within Other Life. So, we'll continue to have access to that forum. So just, if you're reading something, whatever, a couple months down the line that touches on these themes, I'm sure everyone, not only from this cohort, but from the previous one would really appreciate that.
Yeah,
sharing
definitely.
that and just kind of keeping the conversation going. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And on that point, just the final thing I'll say is, stay, if you want to stay involved, stay connected in the community. We have more courses like this running, and so there's always a new influx of people just like you. Also, the community is now like it's almost 600. I think it's more than 600 people, and it's all people just like us. It's all like you, like me and Jeff. We're all there's not a ton of people in the world who really have what it takes to read a lot over many weeks and to do really dedicated, thoughtful, slow, patient thinking and discussing. I'm trying to basically get them all together in the same space, and it's growing every month. So definitely stay tuned, stay involved, and stay watching as it all grows, because we want to hear from you. The thing that I always kind of reiterate is I hope you're all writing these things down as well. You're all incredibly smart and original thinkers. So if you presented today, I hope there's somewhere you have a blog that's like writing these things, right? It's like if you gave a presentation, if anyone who gave a presentation today, I hope that you put that somewhere else where other people can find it. And this is very much kind of the culture and the ethics of the work ethic of the Other Life community is. I'm always really strongly want to be encouraging you all to be writing this stuff down actively, not just now, but in coming months, with everything that you're reading. Publish your work, whether that's writing it on a newsletter or your own YouTube channel or whatever. You all should be cultivating these ideas over time and putting them out into the world in a way that works for you. Please do that. And if you do, let me know. Send me links to your stuff. Send me links to your newsletters, your YouTube channels, your podcasts, however you're developing and cultivating your own research work. Keep me posted on it. Send me links. I'm always happy to share it with my public audience, but people in the community are very eager to work with each other. As Hal has organized symposia, amazing, things just like this course, but self-organized. There's stuff like this happening all the time in the community. And it's often, you know, if it's self-organized, it's free. You can do stuff, you know, on your own. And there's plenty of people who want to do stuff like this more often. So this is just my final kind of last open call to remind you of all this stuff that I hope you're all publishing your work and developing it and continuing it. And there's a lot of people in the community who want to do the same. So yeah, try to find them and stay connected to them, stay in touch with each other even, because it's all growing and there's more and more opportunities for that.
Just to reiterate something I said before, you know, prior to this event, you know, last year I published written versions of a few of the papers that were presented in the final Proseminar. So, you know, if you were interested in adapting it, you know, my blog Outsider Theory does publish a lot of sort of Girard mimetic theory related material. So, you know, you can have a look at what's on there, and it'll give you a sense of what kind of you know, sort of guest posts I've published there before. But but yeah, it's you know, so that's one option. Obviously, you have, you know, you may have your own platforms or other platforms you'd like to take this to, but I just wanted to throw that out there. If you're interested, again, my email is in the chat, so you can get in touch with me.
All right.
Yeah,
all right.
You know, these are all great, so I hope they will, you know, appear in written form in some context or another. So.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the TLDR is just keep going with your work, everyone. This should be the beginning of a much longer research agenda for all of you, and keep it going. You know, don't let this be the end of it. So you're all awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate you all so much, and stay in touch. I hope to see you all on the internet, you know, in coming weeks, months, maybe even years. Thank you all, and I'll let you all go now.
Thank you.